In 1812, Napoleon Bonaparte, the Emperor of the French and one of history's greatest generals, marched into Russia with the largest army the world had ever seen. Over 600,000 soldiers from across Europe, French, Italians, Poles, Germans, Dutch, Swiss, and even some unwilling Spaniards, followed him. Cannons, cavalry, and engineers all moved together in what was called the Grande Armée. At first, it seemed unstoppable, but by the time Napoleon stumbled back across the border months later, fewer than 100,000 soldiers remained. What went so horribly wrong? Was it just the harsh Russian winter? Or the enormous empty lands? Or was it something more human, like mistakes, pride, and miscalculations? In this video, we'll unravel the surprising story of how the mighty Grande Armée collapsed. Stick with us to see how history turned in ways even Napoleon couldn't control. If you enjoy this journey, like the video and subscribe to Meltdown Diaries for more. Why Napoleon invaded Russia? To understand why Napoleon's campaign in Russia turned into a disaster, we first need to look at why he decided to invade. By 1810, Napoleon Bonaparte had almost all of continental Europe under his control. He had conquered or made alliances with countries like Prussia, Austria, Spain, and Italy. Only two major powers stood outside his reach: Great Britain and Russia. Britain was protected by its powerful navy, making a direct military attack nearly impossible. So Napoleon tried a different approach: economic warfare. In 1806, he introduced the Continental System, a strict trade blockade designed to cut Britain off from European markets. His goal was simple: weaken Britain's economy enough to force it to surrender without fighting. But for this plan to work, all European nations had to comply. Russia quickly became a problem. Tsar Alexander I had agreed to the blockade in 1807 after the Treaty of Tilsit. But by 1810, Russia quietly resumed trading with Britain. Napoleon was furious, not just because of lost revenue, but because he took it as a personal betrayal. To him, power and loyalty were deeply connected. Anyone defying him was standing against his vision for Europe. Tensions were made worse by personal slights. Napoleon had married Marie-Louise of Austria, strengthening ties with Austria, and in doing so had rejected a marriage proposal from one of the Tsar's sisters. Small gestures like this added more frost to an already fragile relationship. Feeling both betrayed and insulted, Napoleon decided to act, and Russia would soon face the full force of his Grande Armée. Planning the invasion. By late 1811, Napoleon was ready to strike Russia. He thought it would be a quick and decisive campaign. To do this, he called on soldiers from across Europe. Over 600,000 men gathered along the Niemen River. French, Italians, Poles, Germans, Dutch, Swiss, and even some unwilling Spaniards stood ready, along with cannons, cavalry, and engineers. The Grande Armée seemed unstoppable. Napoleon believed the plan was simple: fight a few key battles, march to Moscow, and force the Russians to surrender. He expected the campaign to be quick, like many of his previous victories. But Russia was very different from any country he had conquered. It was enormous, sparsely populated, and full of hidden challenges. Villages were few, roads were poor, and the distances were vast. From the first step into Russian land, Napoleon's army faced obstacles that no map could fully reveal, and no general could fully anticipate. The stage was set for a campaign that would test not just strategy, but the endurance and spirit of the Grande Armée. The march into Russia. On June 24, 1812, Napoleon's Grande Armée crossed the Niemen River and entered Russian territory. Spirits were high. Soldiers wore wool uniforms under the summer sun, confident in Napoleon's plan and expecting a quick victory. Cannons clanked, horses neighed, and the army felt unstoppable. But problems appeared almost immediately. The first and biggest challenge was logistics. Napoleon had assumed the army could live off the land, as it had in past campaigns. But Russia was different. Villages were small, far apart, and food was scarce. Supplies ran out faster than expected, and the further the army marched, the longer and weaker their supply lines became. On top of this, disease spread quickly. Dysentery, typhus, and lice swept through the troops, killing or incapacitating tens of thousands before they even faced their first major battle. The Grande Armée, mighty on paper, was already starting to crack under the strain of Russia's harsh and unforgiving landscape. Russian strategy, retreat, and sabotage. The Russian army didn't fight like Napoleon expected. Led by General Barclay de Tolly and later Prince Kutuzov, they avoided full battles and instead retreated slowly, drawing the French deeper into Russian land. They used scorched-earth tactics, burning crops, destroying villages, and even poisoning wells. Every step Napoleon's army took brought them farther into empty, hostile territory. Napoleon hoped for quick, decisive battles, but instead he was chasing shadows. When the French finally reached Smolensk in August, they captured the city, but the Russians had set it on fire before leaving. Smolensk offered no supplies, no shelter, and no victory, only ruins. The army gained land, but gained nothing else, and the challenges of Russia were just beginning. The Battle of Borodino. On September 7, 1812, Napoleon's army met the Russians at Borodino. It was the bloodiest single-day battle of the campaign, with around 70,000 soldiers killed, wounded, or missing. Napoleon won the field, but the Russian army didn't surrender. They retreated in order, keeping their army intact and the fight alive. By September 14th, Napoleon reached Moscow, but the city was not the prize he had hoped for. The Russians had evacuated, and much of the city was set on fire. There was no food, no shelter, and no Tsar Alexander to negotiate peace. Napoleon waited, hoping for a resolution, but it never came. Days passed, and the first signs of winter began to creep in, adding a new layer of danger for his weary troops. Miscalculations that doomed Napoleon. Napoleon was known for speed, surprise, and precision, but in Russia, none of these advantages worked. His first big mistake was geography. Russia was enormous and mostly empty. Maps looked simple, but roads were often mud-filled, broken, or disappeared entirely. Supply lines stretched impossibly far. Horses died from exhaustion, forcing soldiers to pull heavy carts themselves. And his second mistake was underestimating the Russian people. Napoleon thought that taking Moscow would force surrender. It didn't. Moscow wasn't even Russia's political capital. St. Petersburg was. Instead of giving in, the Russians united in resistance. Ordinary peasants joined as partisans, ambushing supply wagons, attacking small units, and disappearing into forests. The third mistake was time. Napoleon expected the campaign to last just 5 weeks, but he stayed in Moscow over a month, waiting for peace that never came. Winter crept in with freezing temperatures, frostbite, and death. By misjudging land, people, and time, Napoleon set the stage for disaster. The retreat. A nightmare begins. By mid-October, Napoleon had no choice but to order a retreat. His once mighty Grande Armée was starving, exhausted, and freezing. Most soldiers didn't have proper winter clothing, and temperatures dropped below -20 degrees Celsius, -4 degrees Fahrenheit. Horses were dying from cold and hunger, forcing soldiers to abandon cannons and heavy equipment. The Russian army made the retreat even more dangerous. Cavalry units attacked the French flanks, burned bridges, and cut off escape routes, leaving the army trapped and vulnerable. At the Berezina River, desperate soldiers tried to cross using makeshift bridges. Chaos reigned. Thousands drowned, were trampled, or lost in the freezing water. By the time Napoleon and the remnants of his army crossed the Niemen River in December, fewer than 100,000 soldiers were still combat-ready. Over 400,000 had died from battle, starvation, disease, or cold. Many others were captured or went missing. The Grande Armée, once the largest army Europe had seen, had been almost completely destroyed. Acts of bravery. Amid tragedy, even in the midst of disaster, courage shone through. Marshal Eble, a French engineer, worked tirelessly to build 2 bridges across the freezing Berezina River while under enemy fire. His efforts saved nearly 40,000 soldiers from certain death. Marshal Michael Ney, known as the bravest of the brave, stayed with the rear guard, protecting the retreating army from constant Russian attacks. These acts of heroism prevented complete destruction, giving soldiers a chance to survive. Yet, despite their bravery, the overall campaign remained a disaster. Napoleon's Grande Armée had been broken, and no individual courage could undo the mistakes and misfortunes of the Russian invasion. Napoleon's emotional misstep. Napoleon's last mistake was emotional. See, he thought reason and logic would make the Russians surrender. He didn't see how pride, identity, and survival drove them. Russia could not be forced. The invasion didn't just destroy his army, it also broke Napoleon himself, shattering his confidence and his empire's power. The human cost. The retreat from Russia became a human tragedy. Soldiers starved and froze, some deserted, and the roads were filled with the bodies of men and horses. In extreme desperation, some even turned to cannibalism or looted fallen comrades for food and warmth. Frostbite, exhaustion, and disease were everywhere. Napoleon left for France, leaving Marshal Ney in charge. By December 14th, the remaining soldiers crossed the Niemen River, but the once mighty Grande Armée had been reduced to a shadow of its former strength. Why Napoleon failed? Napoleon's failure in Russia wasn't just about cold or distance. It was pride, arrogance, and refusing to adapt. He believed his skill could conquer any land. But Russia didn't follow his rules. The scorched earth, vast plains, burning Moscow, determined people, and freezing winter all combined to crush an army that once seemed unstoppable. Lessons from the Russian campaign. Napoleon's invasion teaches powerful lessons. Even the strongest power can fail if it underestimates nature, misunderstands people, or acts too slowly. Pride can blind, plans can fail, and past success doesn't guarantee the future. History shows that human choices, emotions, and courage, both our own and our opponents, can shape the outcome of events. So reflection and lessons. The destruction of Napoleon's Grande Armée didn't just change the map of Europe. It shattered the idea that Napoleon was unstoppable. Even though he would fight again at battles like Leipzig and Waterloo, the Russian campaign marked the start of his decline. It shows us that even the greatest power can fail, and that mistakes, pride, and misjudgment come with heavy costs. History isn't just about armies and battles. It's about people, decisions, and forces beyond our control. Napoleon's story also teaches something deeper. How can we apply these lessons in our own lives? Can humility, careful planning, and adapting to changing situations help us avoid disaster? If you want to explore more stories like this and learn from history, hit the like button and subscribe to Meltdown Diaries. And every story from the past has lessons for today. Don't miss them.